The following episode features a historic article from the Nebraska History magazine. This article may reflect the language and attitudes of its time, and while it offers valuable insight into the past, may contain expressions or viewpoints that are outdated or offensive by today's standards. Any outdated terms do not reflect the current views or perspectives of the Nebraska State Historical Society. Welcome to the Nebraska History Podcast. I'm your host, Chris Goforth. Each episode, we explore articles written and published in Nebraska History magazine. March 1st is Statehood Day in Nebraska, and in 2026, the state is celebrating 159 years as a state of the Union. This bonus episode of the podcast takes a brief look at the history behind the Nebraska state motto through the 2010 Nebraska History magazine article, Equality Before the Law, Thoughts on the Origin of Nebraska State Motto, written by James E. Potter. Equality before the law, Nebraska's state motto, is unique among the 50 states. Only Wyoming's motto, Equal Rights, expresses a similar idea. Both mottos date from the post-Civil War years of the 1860s, and both relate to the granting of political and civil rights previously denied to certain Americans, most black men, free or slave, and women of whatever racial background. On June 14, 1867, Governor David Butler signed H.R. 41, an act to provide for procuring a seal for the state of Nebraska. Isaac Wiles, a member of the Nebraska House of Representatives from Plattsmouth, Cass County, introduced the act as provided by Section 13 of Article 3 of the 1866 state constitution, which required a great seal of the state of Nebraska for use by the governor in the transaction of official business. H.R. 41 specified the seal's design and the motto that was to appear thereon, Equality Before the Law. Shortly before his death on January 20th, 1921, Wiles recalled the genesis of the motto. He had proposed two alternative phrases, one being Equality Before the Law, and the other Equal Rights for All. Before introducing the bill, he consulted with Elmer S. Dundee, later famous as the presiding judge in the Standing Bear trial and formerly an associate justice of the Nebraska Supreme Court. Dundee preferred the former phrase. Accordingly, Equality Before the Law was adopted as the motto that appears on the Great Seal, the state flag, and on the east and west pylons flanking the north entrance to the Nebraska State Capitol building. Wiles also said that the motto did not refer to slavery or to granting equal rights to both black and white Nebraskans. Addison E. Sheldon of the Nebraska State Historical Society later wrote, quote, his impression was distinct that it originated from the early controversies over land locations in the Missouri River counties and was inspired by the frontier sentiment in favor of giving every man an equal chance to secure a home on the public domain, end quote. Considering the political issues dominating Nebraska and national politics in 1866 and 1867, and a statement Wiles made in 1892, it is clear that the 90-year-old man's memory deceived him in the 1920s when he reflected on his reasons for proposing equality before the law as the state motto. Fewer than 4 months before the motto's adoption, Congress had forced the Nebraska legislature to remove a whites-only voting restriction from the state constitution as a condition for approving Nebraska's statehood. At the time, only men were afforded voting rights. When the legislature agreed to Congress's fundamental condition during a special session in February 1867, Wiles was among its members. The legislature's decision was certainly a concession to equality before the law as it applied to male suffrage. Nebraska was subsequently admitted as the 37th state on March 1, 1867. Little more than a year before the motto was adopted by the state legislature, Nebraska Republicans gathered in Plattsmouth on April 12, 1866, to nominate candidates for a special June 2nd election to choose a state governor, a secretary of state, and state legislators. If the voters adopted the Constitution being submitted at the same election, the machinery for a state government would be in place pending approval of Nebraska's admission by Congress and the president. In addition to passing several resolutions outlining why they believed statehood would benefit Nebraska, the delegates to the April 12, 1866 convention adopted a final resolution proclaiming the Republicans' guiding philosophy, quote, resolved that the party which has triumphantly sustained and vindicated the government of the United States and carried it safely through 4 years of sanguinary war waged by the enemies of civil and religious liberty owes to itself, to its cherished principles, and to humanity to secure liberty and equality before the law to all men." End quote. Although Isaac Wiles is not mentioned in news accounts as being a delegate to the April convention, he may have well attended the event, which not only represented his political affiliation, but which also was held in his hometown. If he did not attend, he no doubt read the convention resolutions, which were widely published in territorial newspapers. A week after the Republican convention, Nebraska Democrats assembled in Nebraska City. Their convention resolutions were very different from those of the Republicans. The Democrats remained silent about Nebraska statehood. They endorsed President Andrew Johnson's conservative states' rights reconstruction policy and a statement attributed to him, quote, "This is and shall be a government of white men for white men," end quote. Both conventions were reacting to a political firestorm created by Johnson's battle with Congress over the terms for bringing the former rebel states back into the Union. The president and most Democrats favored a lenient policy toward the South, which many Republicans, particularly those known as radical Republicans, thought likely to ensure white political supremacy and the continued denial of civil rights to emancipated slaves. When Johnson in March of 1866 vetoed a Civil Rights Act that defined blacks as U.S. citizens and affirmed their right to enjoy, quote, "full and equal benefit of the law and proceedings for the security of person and property as it's enjoyed by white citizens," end quote, the radical Republicans were outraged. Although Congress passed the Civil Rights Bill over the president's veto, the Republican majority concluded that only a constitutional amendment would guarantee rights and security for the freedmen. On June 13, 1866, Congress approved a joint resolution presenting the 14th Amendment to the states for ratification. Ratification of the amendment by the former rebel states would be a prerequisite for the readmission of their senators and representatives to Congress. The amendment defined all native-born or naturalized citizens, including freed slaves, as citizens. It also included the Due Process Clause and prohibited states from denying to any person, quote, "the equal protection of the laws," end quote. During the same session, Congress passed an act admitting Nebraska to the Union, which President Johnson killed by his pocket veto after Congress adjourned on July 28th. Consequently, Nebraska remained a territory, and both parties had to nominate candidates for the territorial legislature, for territorial delegates to Congress, and for other territorial offices, which they did at party conventions held that fall. It seemed certain that statehood would be achieved during the next session of Congress, so both parties also named candidates for the state legislature and for Nebraska's pending seat in Congress. 2 U.S. senators had already been chosen at a session for the state legislature that convened on July 4, 1866, following approval of the state constitution at the June 2nd election. With the exception of naming different nominees for territorial delegate and congressman, the latter to take office upon statehood, the Republicans on September 6th chose the same men to run for both the territorial and state legislatures. As its platform, the party endorsed the pending 14th Amendment, which was also the Republican platform nationally. The Nebraska Party newspapers published the amendment in each issue prior to the October 9th election. Isaac Wiles was nominated for and won election to the Nebraska House of Representatives from Cass County. He served in the 12th and final session of the territorial legislature, which met in January 1867, as well as the 2 special state legislative sessions that convened on February 20th and May 16th, respectively. Because Governor Alvin Saunders was absent when the 12th legislature convened, Territorial Secretary and Acting Governor Algernon S. Paddock delivered the message. He took the opportunity to question the wisdom of requiring the former Confederate states to ratify the 14th Amendment as a condition for their readmission. Paddock believed that adoption of this amendment, quote, "threatens to perpetuate hatreds, strife, and discord," end quote. Nevertheless, the legislature passed a resolution favoring the 14th Amendment and promising to ratify it when Nebraska was granted statehood. Because the Republicans had a legislative majority and the same Republicans would sit in the forthcoming state legislature, this was no idle promise. Following Nebraska's admission on March 1, 1867, Governor Butler called the state legislature into session on May 16th to enact general laws for the new state government. Among the measures the governor presented for legislative action was ratification of the 14th Amendment. By extending citizenship to all native-born or naturalized persons and prohibiting, quote, the denial of the equal protection of the laws to any such person, end quote, said the governor, the amendment, quote, accepts fully and forever vindicates by the solemn pledge of a nation the idea that was the cornerstone of American independence, end quote. On June 15, 1867, the day after the governor signed the bill adopting the state seal and its motto, the legislature ratified the 14th Amendment, making Nebraska the 24th state to do so. The vote marked the first time Nebraska had joined her sister states in the constitutional amendment process. The amendment became part of the U.S. Constitution when South Carolina ratified it on July 9, 1868, signaling its approval by the required 3/4 majority of all the states. Nebraska historian Albert Watkins suggested that Isaac Wiles likely drew his idea for the motto from the old legal maxim, quote, all men are equal before the natural law, end quote. The battles between Congress and the president over Reconstruction and civil rights for freed men and the maxim's incorporation of the 14th Amendment as equal protection of the laws, however, gave it new relevance and moved it to the forefront of national politics. The Nebraska Republicans had articulated a succinct version of this maxim in their 1866 resolutions. Nebraska was the first and only state to grant suffrage to black men under a specific mandate imposed by Congress. The subsequent ratification of the 15th Amendment to the United States Constitution in 1870 prohibited the denial of the elective franchise in any state on the grounds of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The amendment did not, however, prevent the later disenfranchisement of African Americans in most of the southern states through the use of literacy or property qualifications. In 1920, when Isaac Wiles recalled his role in the adoption of the state motto and said it was inspired by sentiments favoring an equal right to claim public land, he had evidently forgotten both the context in which Nebraska's statehood was achieved and a statement he made in 1892 about the motto's genesis. On May 25th and 26th, 1892, Nebraskans who had participated in the transition from territory to state in 1867 gathered at the Capitol building in Lincoln to observe statehood's silver anniversary and offer their recollections. When it came to his time to speak, quote, Mr. Wiles told how he had the honor to introduce the bill which defined the design on the Great Seal of Nebraska, and that in his mind, the words equality before the law, which are made a part of the seal, meant and should be made to include a guarantee to the women, the right of suffrage, end quote. Without a doubt, the motto adopted in 1867 recognized Nebraska's important contribution in the struggle to grant Black Americans a basic civil right. Thank you for listening to the Nebraska History Podcast. To learn more about Nebraska History Magazine, to listen to more podcast episodes, or to support our podcast by becoming a member of the Nebraska State Historical Society, go to history.nebraska.gov/podcast. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast and get notified when we release new episodes on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, I'm Chris Goforth.